I'm gonna go over 6 reasons why your car's engine isn't getting any spark, and that's why it's not starting. Welcome to Word Wrenching. One of the easiest things to check is going to be the coil, and we're gonna check the ohms. The first thing we're gonna wanna do is we're gonna wanna check the primary side. So what it is, I took our multimeter, I turned it to 200 on the ohms, that's that horseshoe looking one. First, we're gonna connect the two pieces together. We wanna get a baseline to know kind of what we need to subtract from our reading. So we see 0.2, so we're gonna need to take that out of our equation to make sure that we're on the right path or we're in the right range. So we'll go and we'll connect our red and we'll connect the black to the corresponding wires. And you can see we are at 0.6. We're gonna subtract our 0.2, so that gives us 0.4. For the MSD Blaster SS, the primary side needs to be around 0.355. We're in 0.4, so we're right there. This is a $10 multimeter, so it's not gonna be exactly precise, but we're close enough. So now we're gonna wanna check the secondary side. We're gonna turn this up to 20K. Again, we'll measure. We got nothing, so we don't even need to factor that. You're gonna connect the positive to the main cap here, which would go to your distributor, and then we're gonna connect the black to the positive strap here. We're at 3.99. For the MSD Blaster SS, manufacturer recommends that we're at 4.4. So we're in that range. Like I said, it's a $10 multimeter. We know that the coil isn't way off on our measurement. So you can see here, I have the digital 6A Plus box from MSD tucked away in there, and that's going to my coil. So that ohms rating is the only type of test I can do to this coil. If I was running a standard canister coil, I would do a voltage test. So I'd turn the meter to 20 volts, and I would hook up to the positive side of the coil, and then I would hook to the ground, so I would just attach it to the block or touch the block, and I would make sure that we're getting 12 volts from the system to that coil. Again, ignition box changes things. One issue that I had on the Jeep, and it took me forever to figure this out, when I was cranking the engine, it was not sending a consistent 12 volts to the coil, and that was causing the engine to not consistently start. I always had issues with it and everything. I ended up just running a separate wire to the coil to get it to run. So if you're having a lot of issues like that, unplug that positive wire from your coil, hook up that voltage meter and to a ground, and then while cranking, watch that voltmeter and make sure that it stays in that 12 volt range. Make sure it's not dipping below to like 10 volts or things like that. You want to make sure that it's staying consistent across the cranking. Next test we can do is we're just going to make sure that the battery has 12 volts. So we have our meter set up, and all we're going to do is we have it set to 20 volts. We're going to connect the ground to the black and the positive to the red, and we will measure it. Make sure that you're getting full contact, and you can see we are at 12.5 volts, and we're in perfect, so our battery's in great health, or it's at least fully charged. Another issue, and I've had this issue before, is your ignition box fails. I had a Mallory that went out on me, and it had a light that kind of indicated if it was working or not. The MSD doesn't have one. I think it's a better quality one, to tell you the truth. But if you have an ignition box, it's been working fine, and now you're having issues, it's less likely that that's a problem. If you just hooked up your ignition box and you're not able to start, go through all your wires, check them all, make sure that's working, make sure you're getting 12 volts to your box. If it has been working and now it's starting to act up or your ignition system's acting up, there's some ways to test it. I found out mine was broken through the timing test. We'll get to that later. And then another one to check is you're gonna wanna check your fuses. So if we go to the Cobra, and all cars are different, but generally your fuses are under your driver's side in these older cars. So we can see our fuse box is tucked away right here. So I would go through and I would check all those fuses and make sure that none of them are burned out. What a fuse looks like, for those of you that have never seen one before, it's just a connector and it lets the current flow through here. And that wire in the middle is rated for a certain amperage. This green one is for a 30 amp fuse. So if it were to sustain more than 30 amps, it'll pop, cut off the current, and save your car from a fire. If you're consistently popping fuses, you have an issue in your ignition system or electrical system in general. Don't just go ahead and pop in a 40 amp fuse because your 30 amp keeps breaking, because your wires are rated for your fuse, not anything else. And your system is also rated for a certain level of load. So there's a reason we're running a 30 amp fuse. So don't just jump it up, because you could lead to a fire, melt wires and things like that. And then just this quick reminder, whenever you're wiring a car, always make sure that your wire is stronger than your fuse. Don't use a wire that's good for 5 amps and then run a 30 amp fuse on it. Never have a fuse that's greater than your wire's rating. Another thing you want to check is your distributor. So first off, make sure it's connected to your coil. And I've had this before when I was working on a different car. The distributor cap was really old. It was like 30 years old and it was rusted out from the inside. Grab yourself the cap and just pull off each wire one at a time. And you just want to make sure that the point is nice and shiny. It's not rusted out. It's not melted. Things like that. I've had that issue before. And then pull the cap off and look inside the cap. We want to see if the inside of the cap is rusted because it's Florida. We got salt air and everything like that. We want to check the points if it has points. This is a MSD, doesn't have points. Whenever you turn that rotor on a points distributor, you should see a little spark. If you don't, throw some sandpaper in there and kind of sand it, clean it up a little bit. That might fix your issue. So that you'll find that in a lot of old cars. I don't run any of those anymore. So those are quick, easy ways to check without taking your whole distributor off. If the cap's rusted out, just buy a new cap, put the cap on, see if that fixes it. If the points aren't sparking, check sandpaper. Might need to replace the points or just rebuild the distributor internals. We also want to check our plug wires themselves. I've worked on cars where distributor cap was melted, but also the plug wires had completely melted internally. So just look at the wires, kind of feel them, check them out. You want to check all 8 of them. See if the boots are melted. So these, and also down here in the spark plugs, that's why I have these shields to protect them from overheating and everything. But you want to make sure there's no tears or anywhere where the electricity could escape and cause an arc. That'll cause engine issues. And then also just make sure that all of those wires are connected to your spark plugs properly. It's real simple. That would cause your engine to be running pretty rough. But spark plug wires, real easy, simple way to check. Another thing you're going to want to check is make sure that your plugs are actually getting spark. This is real simple. I like to use a spark plug tester, but I've also used it where I'll just take the whole spark plug out and I'll set it against this valve cover here or against the intake. This is all metal, it grounds out, and then I'll watch and see the spark jump. Spark plug tester is easy, it's $6, and then you just hook it in line. You don't have to have any other tools or anything like that. So you can see I got the spark plug tester in. All I did was I unplugged the spark plug wire, plugged it into the tester, and then the tester is plugged into the spark plug. Now we're just going to look for this light to flash while we crank the engine. Make sure you turn off your full fuel pump if it's electrical. All right, let's go ahead and see if we see any spark. So you can see there, we saw the spark and the engine is going to start. Whether or not you have the plug in or not, you're going to have a bad misfire, and you might have heard that right before I shut the car off. Now let's go. I'm going to show you what it's going to look like if there's not a spark. So for this, I'm just going to unplug the coil, so that way I know we're not sending any spark to the distributor, to give you an idea of what it would look like if we're not getting any spark. And you're just going to want to crank it for about 5-6 seconds, give or take. And you can see there was no spark there because we don't have any electricity going to our spark plug, or in a real world scenario, we could have a bad spark plug. So what we would do is we would do this to all the spark plugs if we're having real bad misfire, and that would be an easy way to tell which plug is bad. I like to use this the most for just seeing if I'm getting any type of good electricity to my plugs. That's how I'll do it. If my engine's running really rough, I'm not going to go and do the spark plug tester on every single one of these. It's going to take me forever. What I'm actually going to do is while the engine's running, I'm just going to start pulling spark plugs and seeing if the issue gets worse or better. So if we have a bad misfire and I pull plug 1 and plug 1 is fine, that misfire is going to get worse. So I'll plug it back in and then we'll pull another one. And then we'll just keep going until we pull a plug and there's no change in it. And then we know we found our dead plug. We'll pull a plug, read it, and see what's going on there. And that could be a spark issue, it could be a fuel issue, but on plug 4, if plug 4 is the bad one, we'll plug in that spark tester to make sure it's even getting a spark from the distributor. And if it is, then we know it's a fuel or air issue. So like I said, if our engine is running really rough, I'm going to be pulling those plug wires while the engine's running to see if the issue gets better or worse, or if there's no change actually is what I'm looking for. So once, like I said, once I find that plug with no change, then we can dive into that. We can check that wire, we can check that plug, and then we can really deep dive into why we're not getting a spark there. Another thing I want to check, if we've passed all these issues, I want to check my timing. I had that Mallory ignition box go out on me once. What it was is like, the engine was fine, and then it started to slowly just like, it would misfire and we'd have a lot of issues. So eventually it just wouldn't start. So I threw a timing light on there because I'm like, is this thing way out of timing? What's going on here? This ignition box is only a year old. So threw a timing light on there, and the timing was like, it wasn't consistent. If you've seen my other video on how to check timing, you know there's a constant pulse from your timing light. That wasn't happening. I was getting like 2 pulses here, a pulse here, 3 pulses next week. It was just wild. Turned out the ignition box failed, so we weren't getting a consistent spark to our coil, to our distributor, to the engine. That's why we weren't getting a correct firing. If we're checking our timing and our timing is just, it's not even timing, it's just sporadic. I'm gonna check my distributor, I'm gonna check all those wires, make sure everything's plugged in right, check the coil, do the coil test. If all that stuff is fine, then we know that there is likely an issue with that ignition box. Check your ignition box by doing the timing, and I have a video how to do that. It's real simple. And if your engine is also running rough, but like it's a consistent running rough, it's not that timing issue. Again, check that distributor cap. We're looking for the rusted out areas. We're looking for broken spark plug wires. We're looking for melted boots. Check that coil, make sure that coil is getting 12 volts if you're using that canister style. If not, make sure that your switch is sending 12 volts to your ignition box. Just look up under the dash, look for any type of broken wires, maybe a mouse got in there. Check for your broken fuses, things like that. There's a lot that goes into the electrical system. Those are the things that I'm checking if there's an electrical issue. I hope this helped you.